Welcome back to Farms and Frontlines, everybody. I am your host, Max Terzano. I am typically joined by Jess Rudo, but she is not here today. I am very excited, however, to welcome our very first guest to the show, David Voorman. He's the Vice President of Food Solutions Action, which is a nonprofit out of Washington, D.C., dedicated to improving our food system through innovation. I've known David for quite a while now. I think coming up on almost 10 years. David, care to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Max. Great to be here. I think we've known each other since 2017 or so.
16, 17, 16. Something like that, yeah.
I think it was 16, when I was still an intern.
Yep, same.
Yeah, we interned together, buddy. Missed those days.
It's wild.
Thanks for having me, Max. As you mentioned, I'm Vice President of Food Solutions Action. We're a 501c4 nonprofit organized to advocate on behalf of the alternative protein industry. So we don't have members. We don't represent any specific company or any specific product. We just advocate on behalf of it as a whole, and we really want to see the sector succeed.
That's really cool. I mean, it's not typical, I don't think, at least in my view, when you see kind of a nonprofit. You have like donors or a specific company that's backing you or something like that, but Food Solutions Action seems to be different than that.
Yeah, there's a lot of membership organizations, which would be a C6, and that would be where companies would kind of pay a membership fee or join, and then we would work at the direction of them. So being a C4 gives us a little bit more flexibility, which is exciting. And obviously we have relationships with a lot of these companies and a lot of the members. We work closely with them, but we get to make the decision on what we think is best from a policy perspective.
The reason you're here is because when I launched this podcast, you shot me a text message and was like, hey, when are you going to put me on your podcast? And I was like, when do you want to be on? Thank you for taking interest, and what you sent me was actually super interesting. So I thought it was something that would actually make for a really good episode. And what David's here to talk about today is alternative proteins. So David, when we're talking about alternative or innovative proteins, what exactly do you mean? What are we really talking about?
We break it down into 3 buckets, and I'm happy to just give a really brief overview. I am not a scientist. I do not have a science background. I've got a legal background, constitutional law background, and just a policy wonk background. So I am not here to do the nitty-gritty science, but I know people who can really nerd out on that if that's something your guests would be interested in.
I'm definitely interested in doing that. One of the articles David sent me it's called Mitigating Risk and Capturing Opportunity, the Future of Alternative Proteins. And it was written by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And if you're not familiar with them, they're this major think tank organization in DC. They do a lot of really, really good work. And it was a really interesting read. And a lot of what you wanted to talk about today is in that. So I'll post that later if anybody's interested in reading it. But David, if you want to hop into what those 3 buckets are.
Yeah, so we break it down into 3 buckets. So the first bucket is plant-based. And this is what I think most people think of or know about when it comes to alternative proteins or innovative proteins. This is your Impossible Burger, your Beyond Burger, your Oatly. And it's the simple explanation is it's using plants to mimic the taste, the feel, the structure of kind of traditional meat or protein products. So that's one. You go to Whole Foods, there's got a whole plant-based section. There's plant-based eggs. There's really plant-based almost everything these days. And that's really ubiquitous at this point and what really most people know of and have probably tried.
Sure.
The second bucket is relatively new, and it's fermentation. And then within the fermentation, there's generally 2 or 3 types of fermentation. There's traditional fermentation, there's biomass fermentation, and then there's precision fermentation. And that's as deep as my knowledge goes on fermentation.
I feel like you could have an entire series on just different types of fermentation, and that would be for a very specific audience.
Yeah, very specific. That's true. But fermentation, the process itself is really old. Traditionally we ferment alcohol, we ferment bread, so it's using, instead of those sugars are creating alcohol or bread, they're creating protein. So that's kind of fermentation in a nutshell. And that is also similar to plant-based in that it's using materials to kind of mimic the taste, the structure of traditional protein. And then the third is completely different, and it's completely different in the fact that it's not mimicking traditional protein, but it is actual bioidentical protein. So the third bucket is cultivated meat or cell cultured meat, or what most people probably know as lab grown meat. That's
Hmm.
really the vernacular that's out there. We don't like the term lab grown meat. It's really not accurate in the sense that this isn't meat that's grown in kind of a petri dish in a really laboratory environment. Your
Right.
cultivated meat is grown in bioreactors. And if you've ever been to one of these facilities, or if you go to the facilities, a bioreactor is really a beer vat. So it really
Hmm.
looks, a lot of these companies look like breweries. And in fact, there's multiple companies that have taken over old breweries and used their equipment. So
Oh,
when they say lab grown, it's really more of a brewery grown, which I don't know if it's more palatable to people, but that's it's a lot more correct.
I think you're correct with assuming that, because when I've told people like I'm having a guest on, we're talking about like lab grown meat, like, oh, gross, and I was like, why? What makes it so gross? So I think hearing that and hearing a little bit more about it will kind of ease people's minds, because there is that odd negative connotation towards cultivated meat.
There is. I think one of the struggles that they have is that it's not available. You can't right now go in the United States and go buy cultivated meat. So people hear this. There's I think a lot of misinformation out there about this. There's a lot of I think swaying to say this is really disgusting, and people can't go out and see it and taste it for themselves. The USDA and FDA have only approved two companies and two products for sale in the United States, and those products are really available in two restaurants as kind of a proof
Mm,
of concept. And
gotcha.
then, but if you do want to try this, you can hop on a plane and fly to Singapore, because
Oh,
Singapore has approved this and now is carrying cultivated chicken in their grocery stores.
no meat.
And really the science behind it, like what it is, because I think that's another thing is people just don't know what this is. And so the process is, I mean, just generally kind of a layman's view of this is that they take cells from an animal, and then they put those cells into a bioreactor, and within that bioreactor they feed cells the amino acids, the nutrients. The cells get everything they get in an animal. It's that same
Hmm.
process. They're just getting those in basically a metal animal or in a bioreactor. So they grow the same way they do in an animal. It's bioidentical meat. Or not just meat, they're able to tell the cells how to grow. So there's a company out there called Mission Barnes who has decided that instead of growing the muscle tissue where the flavor comes from is in fat. So they're cultivating just pork fat, and then
Hmm.
they're using that cultivated pork fat. So it's real, bioidentical pork fat, and then they're blending that for a hybrid product. They're using plant-based substrates for that. So they're making meatballs and pepperoni and bacon. So it's cultivated bacon. So it's real fat and then some plant-based stuff.
Hmm. Is this a U.S. company?
It is, yeah. They're headquartered out in California, and they're still waiting approval from the FDA.
Right. Do you have any idea what that'll look like? Because I know Upside Foods and one other were the organizations you had just mentioned that had gotten USDA approval or FDA approval. And do we know any timeline on what that might look like?
Unfortunately, no. We're hoping any day now. So it was almost a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, that FDA and USDA, who have decided when it comes to cultivated meat, they've got joint approval. So
Right.
FDA oversees it on the cellular level, and then when it comes to producing meat, then USDA takes over. So they approved two companies. It was really exciting. And then I think there was some reorganization within the FDA.
Right.
And since then, no companies have been approved. And I know there's a lot of companies out there that have been waiting, that have been undergoing this process for 3+ years now, and
Hmm.
they're still waiting. So what we've heard is FDA is restructuring, and they're hoping to have things kind of back online by October. And
Oh,
then
nice.
we're really hoping that these companies, we start seeing a lot more approvals come through.
Great. That'll definitely be something to keep an eye on. But
I know there's concern, and we've heard it from certain lawmakers and some people in the news that have said we don't know the health impacts of this, and is this safe, and we don't know what this is. And so I encourage especially the science minded listeners. There's a dossier that FDA, these companies have to strictly adhere to procedures, and they have to document everything. So there is a lot of material out there publicly that the FDA requires these companies to do, and they have gone
hmm,
through very rigorous and strict testing and health testing, and there's public documentation out there for anybody that wants to dive in.
nice. I'll have to look that up and make it available on our social medias and all that kind of stuff as well. In the meantime, since while we're waiting for the FDA to get organized and start approving more companies. You mentioned that you can buy this cultivated chicken in Singapore. So what does really the rest of the world landscape look like when it comes to the alternative protein market? Are
But the
we behind? Are we neck and neck? What's going on?
United States currently leads the world when it comes to number of companies. So across alternative proteins, the United States is far and away the leader with over 300 companies across all three buckets that I mentioned. In second place is Israel. So Israel's got about 58 companies. And I think the reason Israel is so heavily invested in this and kind of the rest of the world will become apparent as we talk more about this and kind of the policy reasons for this. But so it's the United States and then Israel and then other companies that are countries that are investing heavily in this: China, India, Singapore, and I think some countries in the Middle East are also very interested in this as well. As far as public investment goes, Israel's far and away the leader in this space, and Netanyahu has said that this is a top 3 national priority. Cultivated meat and alternative proteins, making sure that they diversify and have food security. It's overall a top 3 national priority in Israel.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that because, as you're aware, the show is called Farms and Frontlines, and it's not just about food. It's about the importance of food as a security measure. Food security, and it's easy to forget that this is important not just because it's like, oh, we can move away from like harming animals or anything like those reasons, but it is important in terms of security from multiple different aspects. There's food security, there's economic security, there's like zoonotic or animal translated diseases security. It's really fascinating, a lot more than just like surface level, look, we're growing meat.
It is. And one thing that we tell people, and I'm on the Hill a lot talking to lawmakers, is that this is not about replacing meat. This is not some global conspiracy to take away people's hamburgers and to take away their pork loins and their New York strips. That's not what this is about. This is about supplementing global demand. So global demand has risen 56% since 2000, demand for protein. So we're seeing protein demand globally at an all-time high. And the reason for that is irrespective of population increase. It's because as countries get wealthier, as they get more urban, as we see globalization rapidly spreading, one of the first things that happens is meat demand goes up. It's kind of a really interesting phenomenon.
I was actually reading the book that you had suggested to me, Clean Meat by Paul Shapiro. And one of the first things that they mentioned in like the first chapter, he mentions in China, they used to call beef the rich person's meat or the rich person's food. And as the country, it's getting wealthier, more and more people are able to buy that and eat that. It's just becoming more popular and growing the demand for that, like you're alluding to.
It is. And we're seeing that specifically in the BRIC countries, but we're seeing that all over. We're seeing Africa develop and we're seeing the Middle East develop. And as these countries develop, we're really seeing protein demand increase. And especially if you look at places like China and India, which are traditionally kind of heavy rice diets and not a lot of meat, all of a sudden we're seeing meat demand really go up, and it's not just we're at an all-time high now, but it's projected to probably double by 2050. And most peer review studies, you'd say if it doesn't double, at minimum, we're looking at another 70% increase in protein demand by 2050, which is really serious when you consider right now, you look at land use. I believe this comes from the UN. I can send you the source on this, Max. But right now, kind of globally, to produce our traditional animal protein. So you think about, how we graze our cows, but you also think about, I come from Nebraska where there's a lot of corn grown, there's a lot of soy grown. A lot of the crops that we grow get fed to our food. So when you tally all the land use that is devoted to kind of producing animal protein, we use landmass equal to North and South America as it is. To meet demand by 2050, we would have to add additional landmass equal to Africa to meet protein demand using traditional animal ag. And I don't think I need to tell anybody, we don't have additional land.
We just don't have that available. Yeah.
And that's just land. We're not even talking water and everything else that you need. I mean, we've got land in Nevada, but it's really hard to keep animals alive when you can't get them water.
That tracks. Yeah, I've heard that.
That's really where this industry comes in to says we've got to meet demand. Demand's up there. It's kind of economics 101, supply and demand. And if we can't meet demand using traditional means, that's where innovation comes in. And that's where these three buckets come in to say we have to innovate because the world wants protein and we need to feed the world.
Right. And just to go to read some of the numbers about what you were talking about, I mean, 41% of all cereal crops, like grain and wheat, that are grown worldwide are used for animal feed, according to that CSIS article. And that's an insanely large number, right? And that's just today, not 2050 when the demand increases. So if we are able to, create this alternative protein and have something else out there, that number could possibly shrink. And then you get more grain to be able to go to the countries that are kind of developing and in more need of it. I just bring this up because I remember when I was doing the episode with my co-host on the Ukraine grain and the Black Sea initiative, when they were trying to get the grain through the Russian Black Sea blockade, a lot of the grain would be, large portion of it was being shipped to Spain, and it was just because they had to feed their pigs. So there was a ton of grain that was just going to feed pigs when there are people, right there in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere that were literally going through a famine and starving, and it's wild. So it goes to show you how useful this truly can be.
It is. And if you look at kind of American soybean exports going to China to feed pork, a lot of the crops get used for animal ag.
It was a little side tangent on my behalf, but just think it's extremely interesting.
It is.
Another country that got a ton of wheat, actually, the majority of it was China, which I thought was pretty interesting, especially since, Russia and China are directly connected via landmass, but the majority of wheat leaving through the Black Sea ports ended up in China. And I know you had mentioned that China was trying to kind of up their game when it came to alternative proteins when we had spoken on the phone.
Yeah, China's going in heavy on this. So President Xi, about 2 years ago, said this was a top 3 priority for their ag program over the next 5 years. So that's kind of the Chinese version of the Farm Bill. They said this is a top 3 priority. Since then, they've only really doubled down on that in the press. So interestingly, your listeners may be aware that earlier this year, the Florida legislature banned manufacturing and selling of cultivated meat. It's a misdemeanor that can land you up to 6 months in jail, I believe, for selling cultivated meat in the free state of Florida. Yeah, and Alabama followed shortly thereafter, which we think is really short-sighted, but also really concerning when during that the legislature was debating that. We found a syndicated article we found it in over 30 different Chinese publications, including, I think, China Daily, China Ag, a couple random, Chinese publications. And we used ChatGPT, so not any, super stellar translation, but ChatGPT. And then I believe the Tampa Bay Times had an actual Mandarin professor translated as well. But in this article, CCP, it's obviously in kind of Chinese communist-controlled publications, they talk about how they view specifically cultivated meat as a key in their biotech kind of playbook, as a key part of their biotechnology, and that they view this as really important to the future. And then they specifically call out Florida and say, thanks to Florida USA, who's trying to ban this, they're going to hinder American innovation and really pave the way for Chinese dominance in this space.
Wow. That's remarkable. I mean, like you said, it was extremely short-sighted, but to have the Chinese straight up write and thank Florida for assisting them in this measure in a way that they just couldn't is kind of remarkable.
It's amazing to get an attaboy from the Chinese Communist Party when you're
for real.
This bill, and then still decide to pass this bill. So it was concerning. And actually just last month, I believe the 1st of July, there was an article coming out discussing how China is using rice as kind of a scaffolding or a structure in their cultivated protein. So given it's China, we don't know how far along they are, but we do know they're not being shy about saying, this is really important to us. This is really important to our biotech program, and we're going all in on this.
Right. Okay.
And then that's kind of echoed by the U.S. So the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, in their annual global threat assessment for the United States, for the first time ever this year, calls out Chinese biotechnology specifically as a threat to the United States going forward.
Hmm. And do they have any kind of answer to that, or are they just right now kind of being aware of what China's doing?
We haven't seen an answer. I think it was kind of a just be aware of it. This is an ongoing threat. So one of our jobs is really raising awareness of this, and but it's true. China is really involved in a lot of things, and everything flows through China, and so it's making sure that people understand how important it is that we compete with China in this global protein arms race. And if we lose to China, there are serious implications. And I think the Chinese understand how important this is, which is why they're going so hard into this.
Right. It makes sense. So I did see in the CSIS report that you sent me, there was just a short paragraph in there, but it mentioned the Biden administration's 2023 report, Bold Goals for U.S. Biotechnology and Biomanufacturing. And that's a little bit of a mouthful, but they did have just a little bit of a hint in there that they're for the research and development of quote unquote novel foods. And I'm assuming that means that these alternative meats and proteins would fit into that bucket and that they're aware, but I guess they're trying to test the waters and see, what's going on, how people feel, where the national temperature is for it. Because, we've got people who really just don't know what it is. We got people they don't like the term lab grown meats. Then on the flip side, we've got Florida straight up making it illegal to sell it. And then there are people who are like, yeah, that would be great, but I don't really know anything about it. What really would be the next step? Do you have any thoughts or ideas on that?
I mean, there's a lot of steps I think the government can take. There's this, especially when you talk about cultivated, is we've proven that the technology, the science is sound. And actually what's interesting is, and a lot of people don't know this, is as I go around kind of talking about this, is that when it comes to cultivated meat, this is NASA technology from the early 2000s. So NASA said, hey, we want to do deep space exploration. We want to do manned missions. We want to potentially look into colonizing Mars. We want to go exploring. And one of the key ways, the only way we can get humans into deep space and exploring is we have to figure out the food problem, because you can't send a cow to Mars. Well, you probably could. But it take a lot more to just send a cow to Mars and figure out, okay, how do we can we make protein? And so NASA really pioneered this technology in the early 2000s. And then since then, it's kind of taken off with commercial applications. And we've seen amazing advances. The book you read, Clean Meat, which I encourage people to pick up a copy if they're interested at all. And it talks about how the first cultivated hamburger was $333,000 for one hamburger.
I remember that. I remember reading the story of the guy who ate the steak chip. He's like, it's like a little chip, like a little piece of jerky, like half of that. And it was some outrageous number. And he was like, oh, man. And this was Paul Shapiro, who was a vegetarian.
Yeah, it's come down a lot. I think cost has come down a lot, and they've proven concepts. And now we've seen approval, and we've seen companies starting to sell this. In Israel, Aleph Farms was just recently approved to sell their beef product, which is a really, really thin beef steak. So we're seeing this make sense. Where companies are kind of running into it is 98% of all investment in cultivated meat comes from really private industry, a lot of venture capital. And now we're kind of it's the valley of death for a lot of these companies, where they've proven the concept, the technology is sound. Now it's about, how do we start building manufacturing facilities, getting a lot of bioreactors? You're talking, 5 to 10 years of intense capital investment, which venture capital just is not set up for. So this is where I think any kind of government grants, loans, whatever have you, any kind of assistance from the government would be really helpful for a lot of these companies while they now kind of scale up. But I think most immediately is just having people stop attacking this industry, quite frankly, because since I've started in October, we've seen a lot of energy coming out against cultivated meat with the statewide bans. But we've also seen in Congress various amendments to try to restrict any government funds and any government research from going into cultivated meat.
Right. And I think, one of the big things, like we've talked about, is really just raising awareness on what it actually is and what it means, what it looks like, and all that kind of stuff. Because it is, like you said, it was early 2000s when NASA developed it. But to most people, it's a new concept, right? It's not something that you can go to the store and just buy currently. unless you're in Singapore, which, according to my metrics, none of our listeners are currently. But
And
I also,
it'd be great if we could reach the Singapore market. That'd be awesome.
if you know anybody over there, go ahead and send them a link when this is done. But I did see, like, one thing that was interesting was the report by Climate Works Foundation and the Global Methane Hub that says the alternative protein industry could generate up to 83 million jobs by 2050 if investment increases to levels that meaningfully impact like dietary shifts. And that's no small number of jobs.
No, and
that's a pretty good number right there.
I've heard estimates that this could be a $1.6 trillion industry by 2050. Demand is there, so I think it's going to lead to jobs. It's going to lead to a lot of economic opportunities. The world needs to eat. The world is clamoring for this, and people are investing in this. And if it's not us, it's going to be somebody else feeding the world. And one of the key messages that we keep emphasizing is this is part of ag. This is agricultural innovation. You've got a lot of inputs, specifically in plant-based. We've got a lot of crops that need to go into plant-based. It's right there in the name,
right.
But also within the cultivated, you're feeding them really the same things that you're feeding traditional animal with. You've got to get those nutrients from someplace. So this opens up, I think, a lot of diversification streams for some of our crop farmers, our row farmers as well. And demand is there, and it should be the United States that's leading the world, not anybody else. And the more you talked about education, I think the more I talk to people, the more I have conversations, one of the first things is people say, that's kind of weird and that's kind of gross and that doesn't sound great. The more we talk and kind of explain this and the reasons behind this, and this isn't about taking away people's meat, I think people are really coming around and they understand the importance of this. So that continues to be one of my biggest job, probably my top job, is just talking about this, kind of explaining it. And I understand the kind of the squeamishness. I understand that people don't want to eat this. And I understand that, food is really personal. And
right.
Food evokes a lot of emotions in people. So really when they think, I'm coming to take away, steak dinners, or I'm coming to take away, meatloaf Sunday nights, like I can see where there's kind of some hostility, but that's educating and just saying over and over again, this is about supplementing the world's needs. This is about feeding, a world that is clamoring for this products. This in no way is going to replace or come after, anybody's traditional protein, and nobody's going to be forced to eat this. Right. One of the things is we are not forcing anybody to eat this. I don't want to dictate what people eat, what people put on their plates, what they ingest. That is up to them.
I understand that it can definitely be a tough conversation to get people on board because it is new and different. But, I have been for a very long time pursuing a master's in food and ag law and policy at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And one of the things that I remember talking about when I was first reading about alternative proteins was insect protein, right? And it's not like you're trying to get people on board with being like, you know what? You should just eat crickets. Have this cricket burger. That is gross. Apologies to anybody who's listening who's really pushing hard for cricket burgers, but that's not what this is at all.
No, we often say we are not the bug people.
Exactly, right? Like it could be much nastier. What it is just it's meat. It's real meat. It's just not grown in a field.
Exactly. It's bioidentical meat.
Yeah, it's really, I think it's really fascinating. I think there's so much more to dive into as to why we should continue looking into something like this. Like we talked at the beginning about how there's economic benefits, security benefits, even health benefits regarding, animal transmitted diseases and whatnot. In our last episode, Jess and I talked about history of kind of agriculture in Haiti, and they had a period in the 1970s where their very specific breed of pig, Creole pigs, they got infected by African swine flu through the Dominican Republic and ended up, mostly due to the USDA, they had to wipe out the entire flock. The pig is now extinct because of the possibility of that disease being transmitted over to the US. So obviously stuff like this is safer, quote unquote, in that aspect. But if you're interested in hearing more about that, I really hope to have further conversations with David and a possible more scientific expert, as we've alluded to in the beginning. We are not scientists by any means. Both David and I can attest to that for each other.
That is true. I can attest that Max is not a scientist.
But hopefully moving forward, we'll see if we can get an expert on board to go a little bit deeper into all this kind of stuff, because I do think it's super fascinating. I really hope you listeners have found this enlightening. And again, David, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and talk a little bit about this very interesting topic. I hope we can talk to you again and dive a little bit deeper into everything that we talked about today and get a little bit more involved in the nitty gritty behind all of this science.
Thanks for having me, Max. It's been great. I always like to talk about this issue. I think it's really interesting. It's one that I came in really with no background in when I joined FSA in October, and have dived in and have really enjoyed it. And it's been really interesting. So it's really fun to talk about and educate people on. I appreciate you having me on, and I hope we can do more of this topic in the future.
Absolutely. All right, so that about does it for this episode. I hope everybody has a little bit of a better understanding about just where we're at in the US and globally with alternative proteins. I hope it answered a few questions you may not have even known that you had. I mean, I know I learned a lot just from talking with David and kind of researching for this episode to get a little bit caught up. I will post a link to Clean Meat by Paul Shapiro if anybody's interested in reading that, the kind of first book in the Farms and Frontline book club. And I'll also post a few links to the articles that David and I had referenced in this episode today. Again, you can follow us on our social medias at Farms and Frontlines. We're on Threads and Instagram, where we post updates kind of regularly every Monday when new episodes drop, and trying to be more active in that. Also being more active on LinkedIn. If anybody's interested, you can follow me there on Max Terzano. And that about does it. So thank you all again. David, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciated it. And I look forward to any future conversations we have regarding this very interesting topic.
Thanks, Max.